We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law.
We need to safeguard financial stability.
2024 is not going to be an easy year.
We used to call it the dream of home ownership, but look at Britain now.
We've got to hang on to optimism and hope because it is the biggest driver of change.
Let's stop thinking of life in terms of Brexit. Let's move on and look to the future.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm James Woolcock. Caroline, I've been thinking a lot about some deep ethical questions. Do you think superheroes are people?
Superheroes?
Yeah, Thor's, Marvel, Batman. Are they human beings?
I really hope Superwoman is real. I'd like a go at the lasso, if you're American.
But then also, is it because they're real because they've now been played by actors?
Where's this going?
Well, I saw recently in the financial press that HMRC have taken Star Images, a toy developer, to court. And it all comes down to, in the UK, there's a tax bracket for non-human creatures that is a 0% duty. But for human toys, it carries a charge of nearly 5%. Oh. So the toy company is trying to argue, no, Thor is not a person, and neither is Batman.
He's a god, isn't he?
Yes.
Demigod.
Well, exactly. Batman, he's a billionaire. And possibly Superwoman. I don't know if she's in the suit. Now, to me, this is a big reminder as we head into election year. Deep down, people do not want to pay tax if they can possibly avoid it.
Yeah, look, everything comes down to taxes in life, surely, doesn't it? The old adage goes. No, look, it is interesting. Jeremy Hunt, speaking to Bloomberg not that long ago at Davos, did, pretty cautiously, of course, tell us that he is hoping to make further tax cut announcements after the £10 billion national insurance cut in the autumn statement. There is a lot of pressure, given the polling, for tax cuts or for something from the government to entice voters. Interestingly, also, though, a very ferocious pushback about whether more tax cuts can actually be delivered in the upcoming March budget.
But yes, and if you're not going to pay your taxes, are you going to get your toys? I mean, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, along with the usual call for the government to sort of be honest about the country's fiscal position with voters, they are warning that in the numbers there is this alarming issue. The UK is going to face the worst fiscal inheritance for the next government in 70 years. High interest rates, feeble UK growth, mean that the democratic election is going to be about massive trade-offs. What does the state do? How is Britain going to pay for it? And it means that Labour face big questions about any tax rises they may or may not make. But also the government and the Conservative Party need to make some detailed decisions about what government spending decisions are going to be cut back to make room for any planned tax cuts. As we heard from the OBI yesterday, any sort of government plans for spending beyond 2025 are simply not a reality. He called them fiction, didn't he, the chair, Richard Hughes?
Yeah, absolutely. He said not even fiction because fiction needs somebody to actually write it. And he said that the government hasn't put pen to paper on the issue. Look, is this more than just pre-election, the think tank sort of having a go at government and the opposition party to be more honest and open? Is it more than that? This is what we really want to understand. I mean, certainly the topic seems pretty fraught right now.
Joining us now to discuss those findings is Carl Emmerson, Deputy Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who were behind that report. Carl, we've been here before. Governments are often very vague about how their policies will be funded. Does it matter more this time round?
I think it'd always be good if those seeking office were honest about the trade-offs they face and gave us a really good sense of how they would tackle them. What we're saying is different this time is that for predictable reasons, we know that the next parliament is going to be, in economics terms, a very, very difficult one to navigate, essentially because it doesn't look very easy for the government in the terms of we have a high and rising tax burden by UK standards. We have commitments to have debt falling, and yet it's very difficult to get debt down in a world where you've accumulated lots of debt. It's expensive to finance with higher interest rates, and you've got a weak outlook for growth. And we've got lots of public services that seem to be struggling. So I think getting clarity about those trade-offs is potentially more important given the economic context that we know that we're in.
OK, so given all of that, do you think that means that we are in for another significant round of austerity in Britain after 2025?
Well, the government's plans, which they've published, show them getting debt down at the end of the forecast horizon, but only just. So that's a pretty loose fiscal target. It says we want debt falling, but only between years 4 and 5 of our forecast horizon. So a fairly loose fiscal target, only just being met. And yet to meet that, they've got a tax burden which keeps rising over the next few years, with freezes in pretty much every threshold in the personal tax system. So perhaps bad news on the tax front coming. And then on the spending side, the plans imply some growth in day-to-day spending on public services overall. But once you take out what we think will likely go to the NHS, what we think will likely go to defence, overseas aid, schools, plus the fact the Chancellor's pre-committed a load of money to fund a big increase in childcare, it looks like pretty big cuts elsewhere. So we think something of the order of £20 billion needed to be found from day-to-day spending in areas like justice, the Home Office, local government services, many of the parts of the public sector which had pretty big cuts through the 2010s, and is certainly a big turnaround from where we were pre-pandemic when Boris Johnson was announcing the end of austerity and every department not seeing cuts in their budgets.
Well, I mean, the OBR's chair, Richard Hughes, was scathing earlier this week, Carl, especially for an independent forecaster, saying that government long-term spending plans were worse than fiction. With that in mind, what you've just said, do we need to have a rethink about how do we hold the government of the day accountable for balancing the books?
I think there is a rather poor combination at the moment where we have this fiscal target, which is really kicking in between years 4 and 5 of the forecast. So for good reasons, we have a forward-looking fiscal target. We're looking into the future and saying, what do we think the public finances will be like? But that's interacting with the fact that we don't have any detail on the spending plans for that period. And therefore, if a government wanted to, it can just pencil in spending plans which it doesn't have any intention of keeping to. And that would make it look like it was on course to have debt coming down. Now, to be fair to the government, they have delivered, we have delivered spending cuts in the past, in the 2010s. But in some sense, that makes it even harder to deliver spending cuts now. But I do think we probably do need a bit of a rethink in terms of your question about if we're going to have these forward-looking fiscal targets, maybe we do need to demand more clarity about how spending plans will add up. And yes, tax cuts are great. There's nothing wrong with having them, but perhaps we should hold off announcing them until we've identified where the money to pay for them will come from.
To what extent, and I'll put the kind of bold accusation out there that seems to be floating around, the idea that the government is focused on tax cuts now and poisoning the well, as it were, for the potentially incoming Labour government. What would you respond to that? Do you see signs of that here?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that whoever is Chancellor after the next election is going to be dealt a pretty tricky hand. I think that would be true even if we don't get tax cuts in the forthcoming budget at the start of March. We've got plans which are, as I say, predicated on spending cuts in some areas. The Labour opposition, their policies in terms of day-to-day spending and in terms of tax policy aren't that different from the government's. So there's a very modest increase in tax that they've told us about so far, funding what would be a pretty modest top up to those spending plans. And even if you look at the investment plans that Labour has set forward, where they've got this much talked about big boost in investing on green activities, even if they were to implement that, it would still imply investment spending as a share of national income falling over the next parliament. So I think what I would say here is that whoever's Chancellor after the election, if it's Jeremy Hunt, if it's Rachel Reeves or someone else, they are going to have a very difficult time.
In the report, Carl, you talk about the creaking public infrastructure in the UK. I know you don't know what cuts the hypothetical governments intend to make, but what would be worse for growth in your view? Cuts to government spending and infrastructure or tax rises?
I think a lot of it then comes down to the detail. There's certainly, tax rises are not nice to have and they can do harm to your economy. And actually, our tax system is in a pretty bad shape in that all of our taxes could probably be reformed and be made to work better. That means that if you are going to go down the road of saying we need higher taxes to pay for an ageing population and better public services, what you need to do is reform those taxes before putting them up. So I don't think it's as simple as saying, oh, actually, we have a choice here between do we damage our economy by cutting spending or do we damage our economy by putting up taxes? We do have options here. We could choose to reform our taxes. We could choose to look carefully at the balance of spending and try and make sure that it's as pro-growth as possible. But of course, there's reasons why politicians have shied away from some of the difficult trade-offs that entails in the past. And it's not clear we will make those trade-offs in the future.
A stark north-south divide across the UK, massive public debt issues, as you've just alluded to. Is Britain actually more like Italy?
Well, one of the issues is that we've had many economies have had a slowdown in their growth since around 2007, 2008. We've seen that across many advanced economies. But the UK has certainly had its dose of weak growth over that period. And that's had big consequences, both for terms of the amount of earnings that working households are getting. Earnings growth has been truly abysmal over that period. Very extended period now. And it's also had really bad consequences for the public finances. So it's pretty clear that better growth going forwards would be one way of easing all of these trade-offs. But we don't want to just wish for better growth. If we're serious about it, we need relentless focus on growth right across the board. It's not just about cutting one tax or another tax. It's about genuine reform of taxes. It's about competition policy, trade policy, getting policies right across the board, really focused on growth, and then being patient, because sustained growth, it does take time to reap the rewards from that.
You talk about policy there, Carl. I mean, we're about to head into a general election campaign. This is the first of one of the IFS's many reports looking at the election. Do you think you've seen anywhere near enough detail on policy from either party to give a good outlook of what their governments intend to do?
Not yet. Of course, to be fair, there may well be several months between now and the next election. Both the Conservatives and the Labour Party may be waiting for an updated set of forecasts from the OBR, for example, to see what position they might inherit, to get the best data on that. So it's early days. And I think we don't necessarily need really detailed plans. What we need is a sense of, look, there are trade-offs here. There are trade-offs between planning laws and growth. There's trade-offs between how we feel about immigration and what we might be doing in our social care sector or our higher education sector. There's trade-offs on how much we want to be investing on green activities, which will deliver potentially very good returns in the longer run, but certainly will require big sacrifices in the near term. I think what we want from all of those seeking office is a sense of how they will tackle those trade-offs. To what extent do they want to focus on day-to-day spending now? To what extent they want to focus on getting debt down? To what extent do they want to focus on investments for the future that, as I say, won't reap rewards in the short run, but may be better for us in the longer term?
Carl, thank you so much for being with us. Carl Emmerson is Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, joining us on their latest report. Well, that certainly gives us food for thought, doesn't it, for the next few months? Britain in a very difficult economic situation. The IFS calling for whichever government comes in to be honest with the trade-offs that we face.
This morning, Bloomberg spoke to the Economic Secretary to the Treasury and City Minister Bim Afolami about proposals for a new intermittent trading venue aimed at privately owned companies. Here's what he had to say about the plans.
What we've seen across the world is, over the last 5 to 10 years, a gradual structural shift towards more private capital, away from public capital markets. That's happening in every single country, in every single jurisdiction. The prize is to see if we can marry up that trend with our world-beating capital markets.
We've seen private markets really growing, of course, and there's some concern in some places that we lack oversight and transparency of what's going on in private markets. So is this aimed at addressing that?
The point about private markets is they are that. They are private. You don't have the same obligations that you do as a public company, and we're not going to change that. I think that the point you make about transparency is an important one, because it's really about seeing the decisions that government can take that helps the broader economy. The more visibility one has about what's happening in private markets, obviously that helps the government make its own decisions. So to that extent, transparency is always a good thing. And if those private companies are able to access public markets in a controlled way, now look, it's important to say, the regulators are very involved with how we're going to do this. We're not there yet. But if we can get this right, the prize, I think, for London is significant.
So that was Bim Afolami there, speaking to Bloomberg TV anchors Anna Edwards and Tom Mackenzie just this morning. So this plan to create the new platform that's going to be called Pisces is going to allow investors in private companies to trade shares. Joining us now to discuss this, what it means for business and for investors and for London, Tony Dalwood, who is CEO of Gresham House, a specialist alternative asset manager in the City of London. Very good to have you with us on the programme, Tony. I think for the perhaps political audience listening to this podcast, they might hear the words world-beating capital markets and be quite impressed. The problem is that London has been in the absolute doldrums for the last couple of years. desperately in need of help and support, one many might say. Do you think that this new trading platform is going to change that, is really going to improve things for London?
I think it's important to get perspective here and look at the fact that the culture of the UK over history has been one of being at the forefront of capital markets, as Bim Afolami mentioned. And I think it's important to recognise that, because over the last few years, there's been a lot of mud thrown at the UK market. But the culture within the UK, historically, and this is the key component, is it going to be this going forward? Because if the culture is one of being an entrepreneur, being risk takers, being managed risk takers for capital, for people that want to invest, this is where London has been for the last 100 to 200 years, or even longer, at the centre of trade, finance, internationalisation, technology provision, and that requires capital. And what we've seen in the last few years, the London market, particularly focused on the listed markets, has been secondary, I would say, to the fact that we have lost out to, particularly the US, but arguably increasingly some of the other markets that have been behind us in continental Europe over the last few years. Now, I firmly believe this country has the opportunity again to go forward, and the asset allocation, and this is what Bim Afolami was mentioning, is that the asset allocation of private markets over the last 10 to 15 years has gone from a very low number, arguably zero. If you go back 20 years, private equity was an average of zero allocation. In the last 10 years, you've seen things like infrastructure, renewables, and all other sorts of forestry, all sorts of other illiquid and private markets come onto the agenda and be part of asset allocation, which is now on average up to between 30 and 50% of portfolio construction. And as a result of that, you're seeing the UK being, again, the opportunity to be at the forefront of that. We are at the forefront of that asset allocation, but how do we maintain that? And one of the ways of doing that is to look at new ways of creating liquidity and transparency, which is what the London Stock Exchange was 100 years ago, and at the forefront of that globally. And that what they're trying to do here, quite rightly, is to say, well, look, now the asset allocation to these private markets is catching up. How do we create and provide liquidity to stay at the head of those markets in order to then attract more capital into this country and companies that want to be in this country? And that is what the objective here is. And it is a very, very important objective. And it's one that should be applauded.
Tony, I mean, you say that's the objective. We were listening to UK finance ministers at Davos last week, and they were saying they wanted to make the UK the NASDAQ in Europe. Do you think that's possible? And how would Britain get there?
Look, everything's possible in this world. We have historically been, again, as I keep saying, right up there in number one, number two in terms of trading of and forefront of capital market. In some areas, we're still, number one, whether it be in lights of currency or otherwise. So we have that ability. But what's important is not to get burdened down in looking backwards, and for innovation and a culture of allowing capital markets to thrive. And yes, regulation has its place, but over-regulation, which a lot of people will talk about, leads to capital being diverted into other areas. And that is when capital starts thinking, I don't really necessarily want to be in this area. And liquidity falls away, and liquidity falling away then has a self-vicious circle downwards in terms of effect. So can we get to the back up to the opportunity? Absolutely. But it is really important.
But briefly, though, is this an image problem? And is it one that is in part started by this government? You talk about us being number one and having all these opportunities, but you talk to international investors, and the UK, in some senses, can be seen as having a massive political stability issue.
Yeah, that's an important point. And this is a critical part of this UK looking for the long term, looking and what is important. One is stability, both economically, regulatory, as well as providing and facilitating investors to be able to not have changing environments on a daily basis or a weekly basis, so that when you make, particularly in private markets, because private markets, you're typically locking up your money between 5 and 15 and sometimes longer years. And that means that you need to know that if you're investing today, that tomorrow, in 5 years and 10 years' time, there is no side curveballs that come in that pull away the regulatory rug, the investment rug, which we've seen in other continental Europeans. If you go back 10 years or so in solar renewables, for example, like of Spain, where they changed the regulatory environment, the subsidy environment, it changed. So you made commitments for 10, 20 years, but suddenly after 5 or 6 years, that was changed, and you no longer had those support from the government. And of course, that has led to an environment where people are very cautious to invest in those spaces, supported by any government regimes, because you're not sure if the rules change halfway down the game.
Tony, I hear you in terms of, not wanting mud to be slung at, financial services in Britain and the industry here. I am very curious to understand whether you think that Labour is going to continue these sorts of policies, like this, the new platform called Pisces. Have they committed to that? Do you see anything from the Labour Party that gives you any hope that if they were to win, as the polls point to, that some of this stuff might be long term for Britain?
There's no question that the Labour Party have recognised the importance of the financial services industry. It is one of the major areas of growth for this country in terms of economic growth and therefore welfare, as well as the social goods that can provide. There is no question they recognise that, and they have been doing a lot of discussions around capital markets and those people involved in the city and financial services. The issue is whether they execute and follow up those good words with execution and supporting what they're talking about. So if they do implement and follow us up, yes, there is the capability that we have, and we return to an environment where capital is attracted, and importantly, talent is attracted to the UK market, because the best brains to innovate and provide financial services need to be able to come to the London market, feel that they're rewarded properly, and feel that they can plan for the long term.
Tony Dalwood, CEO of Gresham House, thank you very much for joining us.
So that is on the economy then. Bim Afolami wants to discuss that. But of course, there is the other big tentpole to policy right now, Rwanda, at the centre of the political debate in Britain over the government's asylum policy, with the deportation agreements causing splits within the Conservative Party. Now, Kigali has agreed to accept failed asylum seekers from the UK in exchange for hundreds of millions of pounds in payments. Bloomberg has been looking more broadly, though, at Rwanda's economic transformation in the past 30 years, and in particular, the leadership of President Paul Kagame. And our Africa editor, Neil Munshi, joins us now for more. Very good to have you with us, Neil. How has Paul Kagame then transformed, and it has been a transformation of Rwanda since the devastating genocide 30 years ago?
Thanks for having me. So, you got to think about it. This was a country that was really left for dead after the genocide, and now it's one of the most developed countries in Africa, right? Kigali, the capital, sees more conferences and major events from folks like the NBA, FIFA, the Commonwealth, fintech conferences, that kind of thing, than far bigger and richer cities like Lagos, Cape Town, Nairobi. And at the same time, GDP per capita has risen dramatically. Infant mortality has fallen. Maternal mortality has fallen. And if you talk to Africans in other countries, many of them would say they wish they had the kind of development that Rwanda has had.
You paint this success story in your Business Week piece, Neil. It's brilliant. How has the Rwandan government, though, reacted to the discourse in the UK, particularly about Rwanda's safety and suitability for the programme?
Well, I mean, this is kind of the flip side of that success story, right? That's being played out in the UK. I mean, this political debate is, Rwanda's not a liberal democracy. There's no free expression or a real political opposition, free press, and there are a long line of dissidents, including people who are really close to the president, fought to liberate the country in the genocide, who've ended up exiled or dead, with allegations from governments and critics that Rwanda played a role. These are allegations, obviously, that the Rwandan government denies, but it's part of that tension that makes the country so polarizing, that they've had this undeniable success with development, but the means with which they've achieved it are what's controversial.
Yeah, and the criticisms over the human rights record of the country. Just explain, though, also how Kagame has built alliances, not just with the UK, but with other Western countries. I mean, there are some quite strong ties between Rwanda and other countries.
Yeah, it's this kind of reputation for efficiency, and that they've cultivated. If you look at Total, the big French oil giant, they had a They have a $20 billion LNG project in Mozambique that was overrun by jihadis. Originally, the Mozambique government brought in Russia's Wagner group, and Wagner got routed by the jihadis. They called in the Rwandans, and they saved the project, essentially. And since then, the likes of the US and other Western governments have sort of been not so subtly hoping for Rwanda to take on more of a slice of the, let's call it the mercenary business in Africa, to shore up unstable governments, to save Western interests where Western governments don't want to send troops, that kind of thing. So he's turned Rwanda into, because of this really well-trained, well-respected army, into a sort of essential partner for a lot of Western governments.
Our Africa editor, Neil Munshi, thank you very much.
It's an absolutely fascinating piece. It's on the Bloomberg terminal, also in Business Week, but it is a deep dive into, as Neil was saying, those two sides, the two perspectives on Rwanda now. And I think absolutely vital when you talk about the immigration policy out of the government.
I mean, the part I really hadn't considered until I read Neil's piece was how it ties in all sort of the nations of Africa, and how Kagame, he's now head of the Commonwealth, despite the fact that Neil points out Rwanda is not a Commonwealth country, and its influence it has made itself in sort of the past 30 years.
Yeah. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo, and our audio engineer was Rufa Hussain. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.